What's something your parents believe that you don't?
She raised her glass like she was about to toast me. That's the part that really gets under my skin. It wasn't some casual interruption or innocent blurt out over dinner. It was planned, perfectly timed, and laced with just enough sugary sweetness to make anyone who dared be annoyed look like a heartless bitch. Everyone was already standing, glasses full of champagne. The little jazz trio had just finished their second set, and I was standing with Mark by the fireplace, his hand in mine. My new ring sparkling in the soft amber light bouncing off the lake through those tall windows. We had picked that spot carefully, not just for the view, but for the feeling of warmth and intimacy we wanted to wrap around the people closest to us. It was supposed to be the beginning of our chapter, not hers. But Brittany always finds a way to twist a moment until it breaks under her, and she did it again. She clinked her glass, 3 crisp taps, and everyone turned toward her, assuming she was going to toast us. Of course they did. What else would someone do at an engagement party for their sister? Even I turned, expecting something short and awkward, maybe a half-hearted joke about how she used to call Mark too quiet, followed by some vague sentiment like, I guess he's not so bad after all. But no. She stood there, one hand on her barely there waist, the other hand draped dramatically around her boyfriend's arm, and she smiled with that polished, pageant-ready grin she's been perfecting since she was 15. Then she said it, "We're pregnant." There was this pause, like the air around us had thickened, and for a moment, I honestly believed she had misspoken, like maybe she meant engaged, or moving in together, or anything else that would have made sense in that context. But then the "oh my god" gasps started, followed by the clapping, the gushing, the voices rising all around like confetti, just not for me. Not anymore. Not for the woman in the white silk cocktail dress, with a diamond ring, still warm from the proposal 2 weeks earlier. No, that night, all eyes turned to her. People surrounded her, touched her stomach, asked about cravings and due dates and nursery themes like they'd just stepped into a baby shower by accident. And when she finally made her way back toward me, she paused just long enough to offer a tiny shrug and say, "Sorry if that stole the show." It wasn't an apology. It was a declaration of victory, dipped in faux humility, handed to me like a used napkin. I looked at her, and in that exact moment, I knew this wasn't some mistake, or excitement bubbling over, or bad timing. It was war. Because Brittany doesn't do by accident. She does calculation masked as charm. She does sabotage with a smile and a spray tan. And she always walks away acting like she can't believe you took it personally. But I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't pull her aside or ask her what the hell she was thinking. I just lifted my own glass, clinked it gently against Mark's, and leaned in to whisper something in his ear that would change everything before morning. Now, let me paint this clearly. This wasn't some slapdash, backyard engagement party. Mark and I had spent 2 months planning it because we didn't want a big wedding, just one beautiful night to bring together our closest family and friends before the courthouse ceremony. We rented out a lodge by the lake, hired a local chef, built a custom cocktail menu, and even arranged for little gift bags with handmade cookies and candles with our initials. It was classy. It was intentional. It was supposed to feel like closure on everything before the next big step, and somehow, Brittany turned it into her own damn gender-neutral baby reveal. I watched our dad wrap her in a bear hug, tears in his eyes. I watched our mom hold her face and whisper blessings like she'd just been touched by God. Mark's sister, who barely even talks to Brittany, started asking for baby name ideas, and I stood there with a frozen smile while the spotlight I'd been waiting to stand in for years finally, without comparison, flickered and died. It wasn't just about attention. It was about timing. I had finally reached a point in my life where I was happy, settled, proud of the woman I'd become. I had a partner I loved, a plan that made sense, a future I could actually feel. And in walked Brittany, with her boyfriend of 5 months and her barely there bump, or, honestly, lack thereof, expecting the entire room to pivot around her like it always had when we were kids. That's the part people don't get about sibling rivalry. It doesn't always come out as screaming matches or stolen clothes or slammed doors. Sometimes it festers quietly in shared holidays and whispered comparisons, in the way your mother smiles longer at her jokes or your father brags about her job promotions at dinner, even when yours came first. Sometimes it's in the fact that you can do everything right, be kind, be patient, wait your turn, and someone still shoves you out of your own moment just because they can't stand to see you have it. I didn't say anything that night. I smiled through the rest of the evening, helped clean up after guests left, even hugged Brittany goodbye when she left early with that fluttering excuse that she was just so tired lately. But when Mark and I got back to our hotel room, when the door closed and the silence finally wrapped around us like a weighted blanket, I sat down on the edge of the bed, looked at him, and said, "Let's take her wedding date." He didn't even ask what I meant. That's the thing about being with someone who knows your battles. Sometimes they pick up your sword before you ask them to. So no, I didn't throw a fit or demand an apology. I simply opened my laptop the next morning, emailed our planner, and asked her to check the availability of one very specific venue on one very specific day. I wasn't going to let her just walk away with my night. I wasn't going to be pushed into the shadows one more time. And the best part? She had no idea what was coming. The thing with Brittany is that she doesn't lie in the traditional, sloppy way most people do, with crossed fingers and half-truths tumbling out of their mouths like coins from a ripped pocket, but instead she builds these incredibly intricate little stories, perfectly crafted and timed, sprinkled with just enough plausible detail that if you ever dare to question her, you become the villain, the cold-hearted skeptic, the older sister who simply can't be happy for anyone else, least of all her own blood. It's an art form, really, how she presents these little performances under the guise of spontaneity, when every move has been choreographed in her mind long before the rest of us even show up. And the worst part is, people fall for it every damn time, like they're hypnotized, unable or unwilling to see past the mascara and dimples and breathy faux innocence that always manages to mask what she's really doing underneath. In the days after my engagement party, I kept waiting for the text or the call, or even the half-assed apology in that passive voice she always uses when she doesn't want to take responsibility but still needs to smooth things over enough to keep the peace. Something like, "I hope you're not mad," or "I didn't mean to make it about me," or even just a well-timed "love you," with a heart at the end, any breadcrumb that might make me second-guess what I already knew. But instead, radio silence. Total, deliberate, icy silence, like she didn't even notice what she had done, or worse, like she did, and just didn't care. And in that silence, I could feel my anger curling tighter and tighter around the edges of my calm like a storm slowly forming over still water. It wasn't the kind of rage that comes all at once, loud and unmanageable. It was slower, heavier, more insidious. Like the kind of thing that drives people to make very quiet, very permanent decisions. The next weekend, we had brunch with our parents, just the four of us, at that little place on Main with the overpriced omelets and the sweet potato hash that my dad always pretends he doesn't like, but finishes anyway. I had barely taken my coat off before my mom leaned over the table, eyes sparkling like she had a secret too big to hold, and said, "Did you know Brittany and Evan already started looking at cribs? Isn't that precious?" I smiled, but inside, my stomach twisted. My mom went on, talking about vitamins and ultrasound appointments and how they might need a little help setting up the nursery. Maybe we can organize a little something for them, and all I could think about was how fast the shift had happened. 1 week ago, I had been the daughter with a future to celebrate. 1 week ago, we were talking about wedding dresses and courthouse ceremonies and whether or not we'd write our own vows. But now, all that had vanished under the weight of Brittany's carefully staged announcement, like a birthday candle snuffed out the moment someone else brought out a bigger cake. What made it worse was the way everyone adjusted so naturally, like the emotional GPS of the family had recalculated mid-drive and decided that her destination now mattered more. My dad tried, in his quiet way, to bring the conversation back to our wedding plans. He asked Mark if we had looked at venues yet. But before Mark could finish his sentence, my mom jumped in with a story about Brittany's cravings and how she's been so emotional lately, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a blip. This was going to be how it was now. My wedding was going to exist in the shadow of her pregnancy, and no matter how hard I tried to hold the spotlight for even a minute, it would always be pulled toward her like metal to a magnet. And then came the kicker. As we were finishing our coffee, my mom looked at me and said, with the sweetest condescension I've ever heard, "You might want to think about pushing the wedding up just a little. Brittany's due date might make travel harder for some of the family." It wasn't even phrased like a suggestion. It was a solution, as if the logistics of her baby should somehow override the plans we'd been quietly building for months. I nodded, of course. What else could I do in the moment? Pick a fight in front of the waiter? But when we got back to the car, I sat there in the passenger seat, hands frozen in my lap, and I said to Mark, "She's going to try and take the whole damn year." And he didn't respond with the usual soft reassurance or some passive comment about how it would all blow over. He looked at me, jaw tight, and said, "Then let's make sure she doesn't." It was in that moment, on that quiet little drive home past the houses with their early autumn decorations and the ghost-shaped lawn signs, that the plan really started to take shape. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because if I didn't do something, if I didn't reclaim the calendar, the conversation, the narrative, then I would be the side note at every holiday dinner. The one who had the cute little wedding that no one remembered because Brittany was glowing with life and everyone's thoughts were already on baby showers and bottle warmers and how she was so brave doing it all so fast. I pulled up her wedding website that night. Of course, she already had one. I didn't even need to ask her the date. She had blasted it all over social media like it was an Oscar premiere. May 21st. A Saturday. A vineyard an hour out of town. Elegant, rustic theme. Colors, sage green and cream. The kicker? She hadn't even booked the venue yet. She'd mentioned it at the party, but hadn't locked it in. And I knew this because my best friend Melissa works at that exact venue, and she'd told me that a few weekends were still up for grabs, May 21st among them. So I emailed her. Just one line. "Is May 21st still open?" She replied within the hour. It was. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above us like a slow countdown to something inevitable, I felt a strange kind of peace settle over me. I wasn't going to fight her the way she wanted, by playing the emotional game, by competing for attention or trying to outshine her in some public arena. No, I was going to hit her where it hurt most. In the place she thought she controlled best. The calendar. And the best part? She still had no idea that the date she believed was hers, claimed and celebrated and pre-booked in her mind, was about to become mine in every way that mattered. I wasn't just changing my wedding date. I was rewriting the story. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that doesn't come from yelling or slamming doors or delivering a grand speech with trembling hands and dramatic pauses. It comes instead from sitting perfectly still. With a calm so deliberate it almost feels artificial, while the gears in your mind start to shift in silence, calculating every possible move, every angle, every outcome, until your revenge isn't an explosion, but a quiet, strategic rerouting that no one sees coming until it's already too late. And that's exactly the kind of revenge I was building, not out of malice, not even entirely out of anger, but out of necessity, because at some point you realize that if you keep letting someone take things from you, eventually, you're left with nothing but polite apologies and the memory of what was supposed to be yours. Mark didn't question it, not when I told him I wanted May 21st, not when I suggested we use the same vineyard Brittany had been eyeing, and certainly not when I started quietly shifting every detail of our original plan into alignment with what I knew would set the perfect trap. He just nodded, made a few calls, and within 48 hours, we had a signed contract, a paid deposit, and a date that no longer belonged to Brittany's Pinterest board, but to us, and that shift, that invisible reclaiming of territory, brought with it a kind of cold, quiet joy that settled into my bones like warmth after a storm. The venue, a sprawling vineyard estate with whitewashed stone buildings and a weathered barn converted into a reception hall, had been Brittany's dream setting ever since some influencer she follows posted her wedding photos there 2 years ago. I remembered her showing me the images back then, going on and on about the soft light, the flower-draped archways, and how she could already picture herself walking down that gravel aisle with some folk acoustic version of a love song playing in the background. And I remember listening, nodding, pretending to care, because that's what I'd always done, made space for her dreams, for her dramas, for her endless list of wants that were always somehow more important than mine. So when the contract went through and the date was officially marked as booked under my name, I didn't feel bad. Not for a second. Because the truth is, Brittany never once stopped to ask whether I wanted a vineyard wedding, or if I had been eyeing that weekend too. She just assumed, as she always had, that she would get there first, that I would move aside, that I would shift quietly and make room for whatever she decided she needed. But not this time. This time, I stepped into the space she had marked for herself and planted my flag before she could even blink. We didn't announce the change publicly, at least not right away. There was no Facebook update, no mass text, not even a phone call to our parents. We simply went about planning the wedding as if this had always been the plan, looping in our vendors, updating the invitations, finalizing the decor and menu and music, all while Brittany continued to float through her baby-centered haze, completely unaware that her perfect venue had slipped out from under her like a rug pulled by invisible hands. And the brilliance of it all was in the timing, because Brittany, in all her impulsiveness, hadn't actually confirmed anything yet. She'd assumed the venue would still be there when she got around to paying the deposit, and, because she's been raised to believe the world will wait for her, she saw no reason to rush. The reveal, when it finally came, was not planned with fireworks or grand gestures, but with something even more cruelly effective: casual indifference. It happened at a family brunch the following Sunday, the kind where we all pretend we're normal and well-adjusted and not a ticking time bomb of dysfunction layered under fruit salad and polite conversation. We were seated at one of those long wooden tables on the patio of some overpriced restaurant Brittany had suggested, and the moment she brought up her wedding, with that irritating lilt in her voice and her hand resting just so on her stomach like a prop, I knew it was time. She was mid-sentence, going on about how she'd been meaning to finally sign the papers with the vineyard, when I looked up from my coffee, blinked once, and said, "Oh, weird, you mean the May 21st slot? We just booked it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just said it as if I was commenting on the weather, and in that second, the entire table went completely still. At first, she didn't understand. Her mouth opened slightly, her fingers froze on the rim of her mimosa glass, and then her brows pulled together in confusion before the realization started to settle behind her eyes like a shadow creeping across the floor. She blinked once, twice, and then laughed tight, awkward, shrill. "You're joking," she said. But I wasn't. And when she turned to our mother, as if to confirm that this couldn't possibly be real, Mom just looked at me with the kind of strained half-smile that says, "I don't want to take sides, but dear God, please don't make this brunch worse than it already is." And that's when Brittany lost it, not with full volume, not yet, but with that under-the-breath fury that only women raised to perform politeness know how to wield. She leaned toward me, her voice low and sharp, and asked, "Why would you pick that date? You knew I wanted it." And I just shrugged, took a sip of my coffee, and said, "It's a popular venue. Things go fast." I didn't need to say more. The damage was already done. She left early, of course. Said she felt nauseous. And by the time I got home, the voicemail was already waiting, unhinged, panicked, furious. But I didn't listen to it right away. I let it sit there, pulsing on my screen like a bomb with a blinking red light, because I wanted to enjoy the silence first, the brief, perfect quiet before the explosion. What Brittany didn't understand, and probably never will, is that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's elegant. Sometimes it's booking a date. Sometimes it's taking back the moment that someone tried to steal from you with a clink of a glass and a smile full of sugar and spite. And this was only the beginning. There's something almost poetic about the way a person's voice can completely fracture when they realize that the world no longer revolves around their chaos, when the carefully constructed image they've spent years sculpting, one built on smiles, staged vulnerability, And manipulative charm begins to crack under the pressure of reality catching up with them, especially when that reality is delivered not with anger or confrontation, but with a kind of calm decisiveness that they've never encountered before, the kind that says, without saying it directly, "I'm not playing your game anymore, and I'm not afraid of what happens when I stop pretending to be smaller than you." And that's exactly what I heard in Brittany's voice that night when I finally pressed play on the voicemail she had left in the early hours of the morning, long after she'd stormed out of the brunch, long after she'd realized that her plans were no longer secure, and long after she understood, on some guttural level, that she had lost control of the narrative for the first time in her life. The message began with silence, 3 or 4 seconds of static and shallow breathing, as if she'd hit record in the middle of trying to decide whether to scream or cry first, and when her voice finally came through, it was so sharp, so saturated with disbelief, that for a second I actually felt something that might have been pity. "How dare you," she said, over and over again, her voice rising and breaking like waves crashing against rocks. "How could you do this to me, to your own sister, when you knew?" And then she stopped, caught herself, and changed tactics. Suddenly it wasn't about the date anymore, it was about me. "You've always hated me," she said. "You've always been jealous because people like me better, because I don't have to try so hard, because things come to me without begging for them." And it was in that moment that the voicemail stopped being about weddings or venues or family and became something raw and true and unfiltered, a mirror held up to her own bitterness. It's a strange thing, listening to someone unravel in real time, especially when it's someone who has spent their entire life pretending to have it all together. There was no more sweetness in her tone, no performative grace, no feigned confusion, just rage and desperation, clawing their way out of her mouth in phrases that barely made sense, punctuated by sudden gasps and long pauses, as if she kept stopping to regroup, to decide whether she wanted to accuse or plead, to threaten or guilt. And maybe the most telling part wasn't the screaming, but what came after, the long, drawn-out silence before she hung up, followed by the soft click of disconnection that sounded more final than anything she'd said. I didn't respond. I didn't text her. I didn't call her back. Instead, I forwarded the voicemail to our family group chat, not out of malice, but out of a need for truth to exist in a space that had been dominated for far too long by her carefully curated half-truths. I said nothing in the message. I didn't preface it or follow up with an explanation. I simply shared the audio file, set my phone down, and let silence do the work. And one by one, the dots began to appear. Mom is listening, Dad is listening, Uncle Ray is listening, and although no one replied right away, I could feel the shift happen like a slow earthquake beneath still ground. For once, they were hearing her the way I always had, not through the lens of her performance, but through the cracks she'd tried to hide. Of course, my mother called an hour later, her voice tight and strained, trying to sound neutral but failing spectacularly. "Maybe this whole thing got out of hand," she said. "Maybe you two should talk, just the two of you, before things get worse." And I nearly laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, her endless attempts to balance on the tightrope between her daughters, refusing to admit that one of us had always been more exhausting than the other. But I said nothing cruel. I didn't attack. I simply said, "Mom," I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I planned my wedding. That's all. And to that, she had no response. Meanwhile, Mark, ever steady and unfazed, suggested we move forward with the final planning details. He had already arranged the food tasting. The florist was sending samples next week. The band had confirmed, and the guest list was nearly finalized. In the midst of the storm, our wedding began to take shape, not as a reaction to Brittany's chaos, but as a celebration of something real, something rooted in intention and quiet strength. The kind of event that doesn't need to compete for attention because it already holds its own. Still, the fallout came. Brittany tried to book another venue and was met with a wait list. She posted vague, melodramatic stories on social media about betrayal, and "some people just don't want you to be happy," carefully curated to elicit sympathy from people who didn't know the full story. Her baby shower became the new focus, and though I was technically invited, the invitation arrived in the form of a mass email, cold and impersonal, like a legal notice. I didn't reply. I didn't attend. Instead, I sent a gift, a neutral-colored blanket and a handwritten card that simply read, "Wishing you peace and clarity. Laura." And while that might sound like a truce, it wasn't. It was a boundary. A line drawn in quiet ink, marking the end of something that had been slowly dying for years, a relationship that had been built on imbalance and obligation, finally allowed to collapse under the weight of its own dysfunction. Because the truth is, I didn't want revenge for the sake of revenge. I didn't need her to suffer or grovel or even admit what she had done. I just wanted to reclaim what was mine, to hold my own joy without apology, without being forced to shrink it for the comfort of someone who never once hesitated to eclipse me. And I did. I stood in the vineyard 2 months later, under soft string lights and an open sky, with Mark's hand in mine, and our people gathered around us, not to witness a power play or a family feud, but to celebrate something whole and beautiful and entirely untouched by her manipulations. She wasn't there. She didn't send a message. And for the first time, I didn't miss her. Because the truth is, some absences feel like losses. But hers felt like air returning to a room that had been held too tightly for far too long. It's strange, the things that settle in your chest after the storm has passed, not the dramatic scenes or the words shouted in anger, not even the decisions made in a moment of cold resolve, but the small, echoing truths that surface later, in the quiet, when the adrenaline fades and all that's left is the raw simplicity of what you've done and why. For weeks after the wedding, I kept replaying the voicemail in my mind, not because I regretted anything, but because something about her voice in that message, splintered, frantic, and almost childlike in its desperation, kept needling at me in a way I couldn't quite ignore, as if beneath all her performative rage was something far older, something rooted in years neither of us had the courage to truly face when we still had time to do so without tearing the whole structure down with us. The wedding had been beautiful, beyond beautiful, really, because it wasn't grand or overproduced or crammed full of unnecessary extravagance to impress people we barely spoke to. It was intimate, precise, and calm in a way that felt almost subversive after months of silent warfare, as if we had emerged from a battlefield and found ourselves suddenly standing in the middle of a still lake, the water smooth, the air warm, and the silence so perfect it almost felt unreal. My dress, simple and unassuming, hugged my frame in a way that didn't scream for attention, but demanded presence. Mark stood beside me, steady and patient, his hand never once letting go of mine, not through the ceremony, not through the toasts, not even as the music played into the night and the stars slipped into place like a canopy of absolution above us. And yet, as beautiful as the day was, it wasn't untouched by the absence that lingered like a missing chord in an otherwise perfect harmony. Brittany didn't come, which surprised no one, but what did surprise me, in a way I still don't fully understand, was the absence of any acknowledgement at all. No text, no email, no last-minute, half-hearted gesture that might have preserved at least the illusion of civility. Just silence, complete and total, like a chapter ripped from a book and set ablaze before anyone could read it. My parents avoided the topic, though I could see the weight of it in my mother's posture and the flicker in my father's eyes when people asked where my sister was, their answers always vague and polite and soaked in shame they couldn't quite name. It was a week later, in the soft hush of the morning after the honeymoon, as I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and the window cracked just wide enough to let in the breeze, that I received a message, one I hadn't expected, and certainly not from the person who sent it. It was from Evan, Brittany's boyfriend, or perhaps ex-boyfriend by then. I hadn't been keeping track. The message was brief, respectful, and startlingly sincere. He asked if I had time to talk, just for a few minutes, because there was something he felt I deserved to know, something he hadn't known how to say before, but that he couldn't keep quiet about any longer, not after everything that had happened. I called him. He sounded tired, his voice low and unguarded in the way people sound when they've given up trying to shape their words into anything more than truth. He told me, slowly and carefully, that the night of my engagement party, the night Brittany made her announcement, The night she stole the air out of my lungs with a single sentence. She hadn't actually been pregnant. She hadn't even taken a test. The whole thing had been a performance, a calculated move to force his hand, to lock him in, to secure something she felt slipping away. He said he didn't know at the time. He believed her, as everyone did, until weeks passed and there was no doctor, no appointments, no symptoms, just excuses and mood swings and the increasingly suffocating pressure of a lie that grew heavier by the day. And when he confronted her gently, he insisted, she exploded, not with shame or regret, but with fury, accusing him of betrayal for doubting her, for questioning the fantasy she had created so completely that even she seemed to forget it wasn't real. He told me he left her that day, packed his things, blocked her number. He hadn't spoken to her since. But he couldn't shake the guilt of standing there, clapping, smiling, hugging her in front of my guests, participating unknowingly in a moment that had cost me more than he had understood. I thanked him. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel vindicated. What I felt, honestly, was exhaustion, bone-deep weariness from the years of navigating her chaos, of pretending her manipulations were quirks and her self-absorption was just part of being the free spirit in the family. And more than that, I felt something I wasn't prepared for: sadness. Not the kind that makes you sob or collapse, but the quiet, hollow kind that settles in your chest like dust, soft and inescapable. Because as much as I had resented her, as much as I had longed for distance and silence and autonomy, I had never wanted her to fall so far into her own delusions that she couldn't find her way back. I had never wanted her to become the kind of person who could fake a pregnancy out of fear of being left behind. I didn't tell my parents. Not because they didn't deserve to know, but because I couldn't stomach the fallout, the explaining, the way it would fracture whatever fragile thread still connected us as a family. Some things, I decided, don't need to be exposed in order to be real. Sometimes, truth exists quietly, just for you, and that's enough. Mark and I returned to our life, slowly and deliberately, anchoring ourselves in the kind of stability neither of us had grown up with, but both of us had always craved. We built something from the ground up, not in rebellion to what we'd come from, but in quiet resistance to it. And as the seasons turned and the wedding photos began to yellow slightly at the edges, I found myself thinking less and less about the date, the voicemail, the brunch, the venue, and more about the question that had started to haunt me in ways I couldn't easily ignore. Did I go too far? That's the question I still can't answer, not because I'm unsure of my actions, but because the deeper question, the real one hiding underneath, is this: was it revenge or was it survival? And maybe the truth is, sometimes, the line between the two is so thin, so imperceptible, that you don't know which one you're walking until you look back and realize there's no going back. All I know is, I didn't want her life. I just wanted mine. And maybe that's the most radical thing you can do in a family like ours. Stop playing the role you were cast in, tear up the script, and write your own damn story, even if it means someone else thinks you stole their spotlight. Maybe I did. But maybe, just maybe, it was never hers to begin with.